Hi, welcome everyone. Good evening or good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to our very first virtual reception with the ASQ editors. For those of you who are not familiar with who we are ASQ Blog, which is a student-run organization supported by the ASQ Blog, ASQ Editorial Board. And we have been providing a behind-the-scenes look at the articles that's published on ASQ. On our ASQ blog website, as well as ASQ blog podcast on Spotify and iTunes. I'm one of the organizers, Yusaku Takeda from Harvard University, together with the 4 other organizers who are here today. We have Melody Chang from Yale University, Kevin Lee from NYU, Ayinwi Muma from Stanford, Hui-san from Northwestern. We are fortunate to have 2 eminent scholars today to talk about the past and future of ASQ. We have Henrich Greve, who's the current editor of ASQ. He's a graduate of Stanford University and currently the Rudolph and Valeria Mag chaired professor in entrepreneurship at INSEAD, where he does a lot of research on the causes and consequences of strategic change in the organizations. He has published 80+ articles on leading journals of our field, and he's also served as the program chair and division chair of the OMT division at the Academy of Management. We also have Christine Beckman, who's the incoming editor of ASQ. She's also a graduate of Stanford University and currently the Price Family Chair in Social Innovation and professor at the University of Southern California Price School of Public Policy. Her research has focused on topics as wide-ranging as organizational learning, inter-organizational networks, inequality, innovation, and entrepreneurship. She has published highly influential articles across leading journals of our field, and she's also served as a past division chair of the OMT division at AOM. She has recently published a book with Melissa Matsmanian called Dreams of the Overlooked: Living, Working, and Parenting in the Digital Age. So please join me in welcoming our exceptional speakers today. Welcome, Henrich and Christine.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. So Kevin and I will start the general Q&A session. Thanks everyone for joining our first virtual reception and live interview. We'd like to start our conversation by discussing about the journal more broadly and its place in the field of management. So first, both of you have published across journals in organization studies and sociology. And what makes ASQ distinctive as a journal in your eyes?
So if you'll let me start, I think from the beginning, when I was a graduate student, the special thing about ASQ was that the papers in it were so different from each other and often reflected the author very well. You could get to know somebody literally by reading their papers in a much more almost intimate way than you could in other journals. It's not so formatted. It's very much their view of what the research should look like. Often thorough, although not always really long. So that character was quite nice, and it was because of that it was really a wonderful entry point to academia. Because when I started writing, that would be the journal where I could just write being myself. So I didn't have to change anything. I mean, I did get a fair amount of help by the reviewers in the first few papers, because I sent the type of research that we often called promising, meaning that it can get to somewhere with a bit of help. But that was friendly help, and it didn't change the intentions of what I was doing. And the journal has kept that stance. It's still the same, although I'm now mostly looking at it from the other side as an editor. I think that's a constant.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just add, you know, I mean, so all of the journals, you know, we have a lot of great journals in our field, and so the question is, what makes ASQ different than some of the other management journals? Yeah, so, for example, everyone wants the theoretical contribution. I think what that means in each journal is slightly different. If I think about, you know, what I hear back from reviewers, and when I'm hearing papers, you know, sometimes the critique you hear is, well, this isn't quite big enough of an idea for ASQ. Like it's something that's not an incremental, but really, you know, ideally, right? We all want this for all of our research. We want to change the way people are thinking about something, and so that's. I think we often see dissertations, we often see big projects that come out in ASQ, and part of that is because those tend to be big ideas that people have had, and they're not things where people have tried to slice it up into a lot of different pieces to get a lot of different publications. You know, in my case, you know, 2 chapters of my dissertation became 1 ASQ paper, right? I was fortunate to be able to publish my dissertation in ASQ, and that I think is typical. It's not like you're going to get, you know, you're going to be able to slice it thin. There's a substantive papers that have a big idea with them.
Excellent. I'm going to ask the next question. Thank you both for being here. Related to what Christine was just saying, as those who've both written and reviewed articles in ASQ, what have you learned over the course of the past, over your experience about what makes for a great article? Broadly, like what are some common mistakes, let's say, that junior scholars make when submitting to ASQ, and what are some common perils and pitfalls that you've seen or experienced yourself?
I mean, I guess I'll start with one, Henrich, and then you can jump in. I just did the OMT doctoral consortium with the Academy, so I got to think about this a little bit, and I think one of the common pitfalls, and I don't think this is unique to ASQ, but sort of, you know, we're taught to find a research gap, to find a space that no one has looked at before, and I think that sometimes leads us to maybe not motivate the questions well. Like, why is this important? Why do we care? Why should we be interested in this? And so a lot of papers, I think, fall short because they don't. You hear the reviewers say, so this is well done. This, you know, but why is this important? Why is this relevant? Why is this something that we should care about? And really trying to motivate that question, I think, is really hard, and something that, you know, you sharpen each time you write, each time you get feedback, you sharpen that. But I feel like that papers come in almost across the board with not enough clarity about why we should care, and that's, I think, where authors really need to sort of work and develop and make sure that, you know, you care because you've worked on it for, you know, probably too many years, but why should everybody else care and think that this is an important question to be answered?
So I think what makes a big or an important article a good article actually happens a long time before the article is written. It's really in the formulation of what you want to do, what kind of problem to address, what inspires you. And so, yes, it is true that fantastic ideas are sometimes written in unappealing ways, but actually reviewers and editors can actually help fix that to some extent. But the idea has to be good to begin with, and that's the crucial point. Related to that, I think people have slightly different ways of finding out what they want to do. So I don't want to say that any particular approach is wrong, because I've seen lots of different forms of success. Finding the research gap is one of them. It happens not to be the one that I use more often. I will typically look for fundamentals, and if something is fundamental, then people have tried a few times before, so it has been done. So why should I be doing it? Because it hasn't been done well enough, and so I look to correct. And I think that's it's maybe so that's both looking for gaps and looking for corrections are both approaches that you can do. It takes slightly different people to do either one of them, because I think recognizing gaps is a skill. I also think that finding something that doesn't quite look right and try to debug it and criticize potentially authors who may become your reviewers is also a skill. Right? done differently, but each one of them can lead to good papers.
So both you, Christine, and Henrich mentioned that making an important theoretical contribution and asking important research questions are what distinguish ASQ from other journals. And many attendees have asked questions about like what makes a good enough theoretical contribution for ASQ, and also like what are the framing strategies for ASQ writers? Do you have any advice on that?
I think there's a lot of different ways to frame a paper, right? So sometimes papers are framed around a problem in the world and sort of a theoretical lens that sort of lends it, you know, that helps us answer that question. Sometimes sometimes papers are framed around an empirical sort of a way of testing it that is particularly, you know, rigorous and useful. And then it can be framed around sort of a theoretical question that we need to understand that we don't fully understand. I think all of those can work. I think the empirical framing by itself, I guess in Henrich, you know, you may disagree, but that one feels like the weakest of the three. That's important to have good design, but it's not enough on its own. I think because the question being important and there being a theoretical contribution is so important. But I really think there's not one right, and this goes back to what Henrich said at the beginning, like there's not one right way to do this. We don't have a template. And that is partly because there's different ways of telling your story, and you know that best, and we don't want to give you a formula to follow, which is, you know, frustrating because it'd be nice to have a formula. But on the other hand, it does mean that, you know, you read a bunch of papers, find the ASQ papers that that resonate with you, and use those as your models. Read it not for the content, but for the form and the style and the substance. We often think about reading an article for the ideas that it contains, but we can also read them for ways of organizing our ideas. And I think you can see the different models that have come up in ASQ, and so you could use that as a strategy to find ones that resonate with you and the story you want to tell.
So just following on my way of thinking about it, where the good paper happens maybe a year or two, probably 2 years before the writing of the paper happens, because the project is the paper. Those are the kind of papers where the framing is obvious and you can't actually reframe it, because there is one particular idea, usually a theoretical idea, that's driving the whole thing. So it only makes sense in one way. Those are, in a way, the easiest ones to write. They may be among the hardest ones to think about, because they are so they're sort of a single message kind of paper. But once you've made that type of research design, usually as the result of one theoretical problem you see and you want to fix, then that is the frame. Now, there is one more step, which comes to Christine's advice to read lots of papers. Even though you know the frame, how to express the frame is yet another step. How do you most effectively say what is your message? And that just takes a lot of reading, because you can't consciously imitate anything that's been done, but if it gets into your mind through reading and reading and reading, then that's how you end up writing things. And it's actually a skill that's it's a pleasant skill to acquire, because it means you have to read lots of good articles.
Building on that, actually, we were wondering as well if you've seen any particular, if you could point to any exemplary articles that you've read over the past few years, let's say, that you just think is like an exemplar of what great ASQ work is like.
It's such an impossible question for me to answer, because I write the blog, I read every single paper, and every time I read a paper, I fall in love with that particular paper, and I write about it. And so, you know, it's the last one I read, which isn't a very useful answer, I think. But that's, of course, that means that I read them as a consumer of the research. I read them just to see what the insights are, not because I'm going to make the same kind of research. And I think that's fine. I think we, as researchers, we should both be consumers of research and enjoy them. And I can read an entire issue, enjoy every one of them. Then maybe we read the ones that are more closely related to what we do. And, you know, which ones I'm going to pick are going to be pretty specific to what I'm doing. And I have my biases. In fact, some of the papers that I love the most are not papers that I've written, they're papers that I've edited, because there's a certain, you know, special pleasure in seeing a paper that you are the editor of and it comes out and it does fantastically well. Should I name names or I shouldn't?
Yeah, no, so I look back at the last year or so of issues just with this question in mind, Kevin, and it is very hard. And, you know, I guess, and it also depends on what methodology, you know, so I may like a paper that's very different than a paper I could actually write, right? And maybe it's not a methodology that I can do, but for me, that, so I'll name, so they're the papers that I handled, right? That, as Henrich said, so you watch those papers develop, and you know, I think one of the aspects that we pride ourselves at ASQ is sort of the developmental review process, which you may have heard people talk about that before, right? That really we want to help papers develop over time and really become clear in their contributions. And so once you get invested in a paper and you see it develop, and so all of those papers, I feel a special fondness toward. So that's like, you know, asking you to pick between your favorite children's. So I don't want to do that. But so the one that I didn't handle, so I picked one that I didn't handle at all, but Irene Padbeck and Robin Eli and Aaron Reed have a paper that came out in the March issue on work-family narratives, and that sort of relates to some work that I'm doing, not work I've published in ASQ, but to the book I wrote about work-family. And what I loved about the paper, it's a qualitative paper, and so as you know, ASQ publishes both qualitative and quantitative, experimental, so that breadth. But what I liked about this paper, and I think is the hallmark of what to me stands out, is, you know, they start with this idea that, you know, that work-family, balancing work-family is a challenge in this organization, and you know, the organization is trying to fix it, and it turns out that the work-family narrative is the problem in and of itself, right? That that's not actually the problem people are experiencing. People are experiencing the challenge of too much work and too many work demands, and it's not a woman's issue, it's not a work-family issue, it's the issue of the work asking to, and so they sort of turn it on its head, right? They take this idea that's pretty well established around work-family, and, you know, women have trouble balancing, and they say, no, that's actually not what it's about at all, and they sort of go on to tell a story. And I think that's something that I really is hard to do, right? But you can sort of say, this way we've always thought about it isn't the way it actually is operating, and let me show you what's really happening. So that kind of framing for me, I find really compelling.
Good example of a paper that's making a correction to something that people have been thinking about for a while, but look, you're thinking about this all wrong.
Excellent. Now we'd like to shift the direction a little bit and talk a little bit more about the future of the journal. So what do you think are the trends that you feel are especially promising in our field? Like it could be theoretical or methodological or empirical. So where do you see our field going?
So many trends. Some of them are big and others are so small and young that maybe we're biased in pointing any of them out. I mean, let's engage in a small piece of self-promotion, which is, I think, also promotion for Christine. I mean, learning research has been going absolutely crazy for a while in terms of the volume of papers and all the issues that it's addressing. But I think that's pretty established. That's not a new trend. It's been how much has it been? A decade in the making, something like that.
Yeah,
So that's not really, yeah.
And then there's always new methods that come up, right? So you might see some work in linguistics, you see sort of machine learning technique. I mean, so you see, what's hard, right, is to know what's going to stick, right? There's some trends that come and go and don't really take off, and there's others that then sort of take over the field. And I don't know that I have any special insight on what that's going to be. But you do see a variety of different methods and new ideas there that I think are exciting.
I was going to mention linguistics, and because I also see that as a trend, but I think people are thinking about it in not quite the right way, because currently people are thinking of it as a method, and they're using it as a method, and that's fine, it is a method. But let's be organizational scholars for a moment. What is the theory associated with it? Well, organizations do things and organizations say things. And what is the connections between saying something and doing it, or the other way around, doing something and then saying something? Does that sound like a fairly fundamental theoretical question? It does to me. And that is different from most, not all, but it's different from most of what I've seen in terms of use of linguistics. I think that's an exciting direction. There's some work along those lines, but far from enough. Connection between what they say and what they do.
At the doctoral consortium that I was at last week or the week before, and this is the problem with this. One of the problems with this format is I don't get to know the names that go with the faces as well, so I can't remember which of the students said this, and I feel terribly. But I thought it was really smart, right? When the question was in this era, in this pandemic era, is our unit of analysis still the organization, right? Or is it going down to, you might think about individuals or families, you might think about states and governments, and I thought that was a really interesting question about, does this moment change the unit at which we should be studying, given at the macro level and the micro level. I think you're seeing it at both ends. So I thought that's more like, where might we go? And I'm not sure we will, but I thought that was a really interesting observation.
I was just asked to provide some government advice. In fact, I'll do it next week. It is related to what this pandemic is doing, and it was an open-ended question. Just tell us what's happening. They didn't have any particular agenda, and so of course I put my own knowledge and biases on it. And let's think about pandemics, work at home, and organization. What happens? Well, what happens is that the whole thing splinters apart, and you have this thing called a routine, which is co-action of people who can usually be in some proximity to each other, or at least they have some awareness of what the others are doing and when, and how that affects what I should be doing. That is not happening right now in a lot of places. And of course, something else is happening instead. We don't know what that is. At some point, there will be a partial or a full return to that location we call the workplace, which we take for granted. And we're not exactly sure what's going to happen either, because reassembling routines is quite different from developing them in a workplace. So that's going to be one of my main messages. There you go. You're not the government, but you got part of the advice right away.
I believe we have a question from the audience that Hui maybe wanted to bring up.
Yeah, so we have a number of questions related to methods going forward for ASQ. So there's a question about, does ASQ also publish mixed method papers? There's a related question about the ratio of quantitative versus qualitative papers. So I think what we are asking is basically what proportion of different kind of methods paper are we looking forward to in ASQ, and also are ASQ welcoming comparatively more rare kinds of method paper like meta-analysis, mixed method papers, and things like that.
I wish I remembered those proportions. Any help
Yeah.
from you there,
Yes.
Joan? Or
Well, and I did this for the doctoral consortium, so I know, so that on the qualitative, quantitative side, about, I think it was about 25% tend to be have qualitative methods. I definitely, yes, on the mixed methods. I think a lot of papers that I've handled, I see mixed methods, whether that's an experiment to try and test a mechanism, whether that's interviews and some qualitative and quantitative data. I think you definitely see, I've definitely seen both. I've handled a meta-analyses. I don't know that we've published any of those historically.
a long time ago.
Yeah, but not that we don't see as often, I would say probably, but certainly yes on the mixed methods.
It's actually the mixed method question is interesting, and I think I mean, this is something we all have slightly different views on. The type of mixed method paper that we see more of these days is the kind that makes quite a bit of sense, where there is a particular portion of the mechanism where you have to draw some inference about it if you just follow one type of method, but you can often with an experiment be more specific about the mechanism if you insert that as one other way of doing it. So those are fine. Also, the mixture of qualitative and quantitative methods, they can often work very well and be quite informative. But there I have, at least as a personal view, you see, I've been doing that type of mixed method throughout my career. It's just that I never published the qualitative part of it or even tried to let it get into the papers. That's just what I do to learn the industry that I'm studying. Because to me, the theory is just an entirely separate thing, but I need to know how to apply the theory, and I want to make sure that I don't miss anything. I don't actually have to report how I don't miss anything.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, Henrich, too. That even if you've done interviews, that doesn't mean they need to be necessarily in the paper. Like that's understanding your context. So if it adds something, I think it can, but it doesn't need to be. Because if you do, if it's going to be mixed methods in that way, it's difficult in the sense of the kinds of analysis that you have to do on both fronts, right? So you have to do a qualitative analysis and a quantitative analysis. I think that can become overwhelming. And is it worth doing that, or those interviews to help you understand the context, to give you some face validity? And that's different than a true mixed method qualitative quantitative paper in my view.
Should make the reservation that both of us are talking as people who are generally trained in theory first way of working. So, I mean, when I go and get to learn a particular context where I want to do a study, I know what I'm going to study. I just don't want to make any mistakes.
Yeah, and there was one of the questions in the chat about question-driven, phenomenon-based approaches in qualitative research, and I think that is a place where it's hard to go in with a theory, right? You go in with a question, you go in with a phenomenon, and I think that is a fine way to go in. But then when you're writing the paper, you need to be probably, then I've done qualitative work and I end up writing papers that weren't at all what I thought I was going to be studying. But in the process of doing that, then I learn the theories that are relevant to what I've learned and figure out how I'm contributing to those. So it's not an either or. I think it's an and it's just about order.
But so we have one more question and then we'll open it up for a more open Q&A. But our question has to do with COVID, just building on some of the things you both were already speaking about COVID, but has COVID-19 had any influence on or changed in any way your vision of ASQ's direction going forward? And maybe tied to this, what are your thoughts on the role of management research in society more broadly?
So we're expecting to see research inspired by this pandemic, definitely. I mean, it's such an important event, and it is a type of event that will probably expose some new theoretically important issues, or even again allow for corrections of things that we thought we knew, but they are actually different from what we thought. Now, we haven't received submissions yet, and that's a good thing, because it takes a while to really produce very solid research. We're not in a hurry. I mean, we have not announced any special COVID issues that are supposed to come out during 2020, because that wouldn't be the type of research with the depth that we're looking for. I'm sorry to say that, because I know that some other journals have done it, but we take our time. We don't have to publish anything like this while the pandemic is going on. There will be another one. That's just the way things work, and we should go for research that will let us know really well what's going to happen next time around. That's the best kind. So that's one thing. What the kind of research we're waiting for. We're waiting for that, and when the good articles come in, they will appear on our pages. In terms of how we do our work, I think we already sent some messages out to the editorial board, just acknowledging that this is a very busy time for us. We're getting more submissions than usual, not fewer. And at the same time, we have a very busy editorial board because of the various events. That's a result of the pandemic, like work from home. So things are a little bit under pressure, but they've held up remarkably well. And to some extent, it's also allowed us to try out more ad hoc reviewers than we would normally do. And that's good, because ASQ is a big community, and we need to invite people in to review and to help us. And to some extent, we have sort of a blessing and a curse of having such a good editorial board that we often don't send out papers for review among the ad hoc reviewers as much as we perhaps should. Those are, anyway, some of my observations. Christine, you want to add?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add on the pandemic side is, so I don't know if, how many of you have seen the open letter to young scholars that Damon Phillips wrote, and I think I'll put it in the chat if you haven't seen it. I recommend it. He's an organization scholar, and he wrote about this being a moment where there's going to be new questions that we can answer, and that this is actually perhaps a moment for organization scholarship to really rise and use our tools in new ways and develop new theory. Like, so that it's a very inspiring message of one of theoretically that this is a moment where I think our tools are useful that we have developed as scholars, and they may help us think about problems in new ways. So that's sort of the, yeah. And when they hit, we hope they'll come to ASQ, right? Because I think that there is a reimagining that is probably going to be happening.
One of the reasons we would be particularly friendly is that one of the things that I think ASQ takes pride in making large theoretical contributions, and that will sometimes include, here is something that none of you have seen or thought about before. It is really hard to connect it to any particular research stream, but it is so important that we need to do it. That is the type of paper that we're quite open to, and not all journals will know how to handle such a paper. I mean, who do you send it out to for review? Should the editor be friendly to papers like that or not? I mean, I think we're pretty good at handling those.
Could I add two things just slightly on the reviewer front, sort of watching the comments as well, sort of on there are two very practical questions about how do you get a friendly review and how do I start to review for ASQ, which I think are both important things sort of worth making sure we talk about. And so the friendly reviews, you know, if it is important, right? I mean, especially with your dissertation work that you've been close to for a long time, even your committee members by the end, right, don't see it as a new paper, right? They've read it too many times. So getting people that are unfamiliar with your work to read it before you send it out to ASQ is super useful. And so how you do that, I mean, there's lots of different ways. Finding buddies, right? That whether this is at your institution, whether this is from graduate school, whether it's people that are doing research in similar areas, but it doesn't even have to be a similar area. It doesn't have to be an expert in the area to read your paper and sort of say, I didn't really understand what you were saying here, or, right? Because there's so many details that you have to figure out which ones go in the paper and which ones are going to be left out. So finding people that you can swap with, you know, I'll do that for you if you do it for me. And it's often people at the same stage of career that I find it's easiest to find people to do that with. Although, you know, senior scholars at your institution might be willing to do it too. And then on the reviewing for ASQ, we do rely on ad hoc reviewers. I guess I don't know if you have advice about how to go about this, Henrich. I know sort of Joan will sometimes email us people that are interested in reviewing if we don't know them. If there's an associate editor that is handling papers in the area that you are an expert in, emailing them and saying, you know, I'm interested in reviewing for ASQ. If you ever need a reviewer, this is my area of expertise. I think that I get emails like that, and I'm always happy to get emails like that. But yeah, how do you get into the into the circle of people that we might call on, I think is something that, you know, as I become editor, is something I'm thinking a lot about, is how do we make sure we're expanding the group of experts that we're calling on.
It's something that we think about because it's a lot harder to get into our circle of regularly used reviewers than it is to stay there, because all you need to do to stay there is just to write good reviews. I mean, it's not too hard, you know how to do it. We just on the issue of getting friendly reviews, I think a lot of people are doing the right thing in terms of sending out papers of friendly reviews, but there's a problem on the other side, and I'm not sure how to solve that problem. So you send it to your friend for friendly review. How do you make them less friendly? They have to understand that they need to be reviewer too. All right, and they should act like reviewer too. If it's somebody that you don't know quite as well, how do you make them less polite? Because they need to be convinced that you're not going to take it too personally if they are really critical, if they are acting like a reviewer too. We have a little bit of a problem of norms there, because somebody who gives very frank reads, which sometimes, more often, results in somewhat brutal responses that are actually very useful. They can get reputations that aren't so good, even though they are wonderful people in a way. We need to work on our norms a little bit there. Tell your friends to be less friendly and more useful.
So I'll piggyback on that because we have two more comments coming from the audience that are related to the review process. So one scholar asked, when submitting a paper to ASQ and other journals, to what extent editors would choose the associate editors and reviewers that the author suggests in the submission portal? And what is the essential role of an associate editor? To what extent an associate editor is like the fourth reviewer?
Okay, there are some journal differences there. I think it's always useful to make suggestions for reviewers and editors. We take that as information. So we also read the whole paper, and when it comes to both sides of the recommendations, it's not unusual that we have ideas that we think are better. So you may well end up with a different editor than the one you propose, because the editor happens to know that there's some other editor who actually has a better skill set for it. That is more likely to happen at ASQ than in some of the other journals, because we know each other very, very well. Right? So in other journals, it's actually those suggestions are quite likely to happen. On the reviewer side, there's a similar issue. All right, but of course there you won't see it because they're anonymous. In fact, part of what we try to do is that we're trying to keep the volume of papers that we handle and give full treatment at ASQ down to a reasonable number per editor, so that even before it goes out to review, the editor has a quite good idea of what the paper is about, some of the strengths and weaknesses, which allows assigning exactly the right kind of reviewer that will help this particular paper. That's much more important than a fourth reviewer, because there is already an idea about the paper before it goes out, and the 3 reviewers are picked for that purpose. Once the reviews come back, if the selection of reviewer has worked the way it should work, they really just provide additional information, and the editor isn't the fourth reviewer, the editor is a decision maker. Whenever there's something that falls short, so if I've sent them out for reviews, I have certain expectations of the reviewers, and I remember from the paper that something was supposed to be looked at, but it wasn't, then I step in. But that's actually quite rare. All right, so it can happen. It just depends on what the 3 reviewers did.
Yeah, and that's why the only other thing to add here is that the associate editor isn't just taking the vote of the reviewers and saying, okay, 2 liked it, 1 didn't. The associate editor's role is to make an assessment, and there's things that you don't see in the review process. The strength of reviewers sometimes will write a review, and then in the private comments will raise more serious flags, or so it's hard sometimes when you get a set of reviews back to sort of know exactly what it is. But the general point being, the associate editor's role is not to be a fourth reviewer, but not to take votes, right? But to really use their expertise and the reason they're an AE and take the input of the reviewers to make a decision. And that really is delegated to the associate editors. Henrich is not at the top, sort of then overseeing as the associate editors and saying, no, I disagree with you here, that the AEs are making independent judgments.
Oh yeah, things I take for granted too much, so I don't even mention them. Yes, the associate editor handles things completely. And no, we don't take votes. In fact, there are several ways that things can just go wrong for paper, and one of them, fortunately it's a pretty unusual one, is where suppose there are 3 reviewers who see potential in a paper, but they see potential for a paper that's quite different from what the author intended, and those 3 potentials are different from each other. And an editor will look at this and see, okay, doesn't happen often, but see 3 R&Rs, and it's a complete mess. And what do you do? Well, that depends on the editor. I'm not going to give you an answer to what the editor will do there, because they really have to make a careful assessment of what the paper is like, what is best for the paper and the journal. But certainly one of the possibilities is to simply reject the paper.
It's just a hard call, because you don't want to drag papers out that don't, and then I've gotten 2nd and 3rd round rejections before. It's the worst. Like no one wants to get that. You put so much effort into a paper, and so I think we're trying to make sure, you can't make sure, but you're trying to make that assessment of okay, does this really have potential to make it all the way through? And if I don't see it, my judgment as an associate editor is I'm gonna say reject, because that the worst thing I could do is have this go for a year and a half and then for you to get rejected. You might be better off than just going elsewhere. And on the author side, and that has certainly happened to me at ASQ and elsewhere, where the editor sort of says, this set of reviewers is not going to come to agreement. So and I can't, so go somewhere else. ASQ, we don't sort of say it that way. I mean, I think because this associate editor can overrule reviewers and do whatever that they think is best. But that general idea, I think, is accurate, which is sometimes it's like this, it's not going to fly. And so for whatever reason, you're better off going off and redoing it and sending it somewhere else than continuing with this particular process.
So it looks like there are quite a few questions along this theme of negotiating what to do when you perhaps get divergent feedback, perhaps that reviewer number 2, as you mentioned. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit to what your process is like when an editor thinks a paper has promise, but perhaps the reviewers themselves don't like it. That's one of the questions. And then another that I think is perhaps in line with this is whether you have relied on copy editors to kind of help with the revisions or production process at all.
So I guess I'd say 2 things. One, and I'm going to have lost them in the as I started to speak. So as an associate editor, I will often signal what parts of reviews I think are the places to focus, right? So the associate editor would be a place to look for how do you resolve these disagreements. If it's not in the letter, it's perfectly appropriate to email the associate editor to ask for advice in an R&R process. I definitely have conversations like that with authors. And then I think if there's things that you aren't going to be able to do or you don't think are the right thing to do, then I think in the revision process, that's what you write. You explain why you don't think that's the right thing to do as you're doing. You don't have to do, it's your paper. You don't have to do everything that you've been asked to do. But it is to your benefit to explain why it is that you don't think that's the right move. But that not in the paper itself, but in the responses.
So I typically encourage all associate editors to write the decision letters. I don't want to use the word forcefully, but you understand the idea. What the editor thinks about the paper should be quite clear. Now, the decision letter shouldn't be overly long either, because that's I think that's in most cases, if it has to be really long, then there are probably more things wrong with the paper than there should be if you're giving a revision. Or the editor is micromanaging more than an editor should, because it is the author's paper. So one of the 2 things is wrong if a decision letter is overly long. But that leaves that little point of ambiguity where the reviewers raise points that the decision letter doesn't respond to. And in general, I will leave things uncommented if they're pretty obvious. So just go ahead and do it, or if they're fairly voluntary, I don't have a really strong reaction to them. But there's a possibility that the reviewer has a strong reaction to it. So then what do you do? Exactly what Christine says. You can get in touch about something unmentioned. Do I have to do it this way or that way? The recipe, the easy recipe, is to pay very close attention to the decision letter. Now, that can sometimes lead to paper that isn't really the paper you wanted. And in that case, the decision letter, you have to respond to that one as well. You have to tell the editor, look, if I do exactly as you say, the following things are going to go wrong with the paper. It's going to be less persuasive or less important theoretically or empirically. And that's a discussion we can have.
Thank you. And I think at this point, we want to open it up so that folks have a chance to speak directly. We can get a diversity of voices on the call. And with that segue, I'll turn it to, is it Yi-Lin? You just posted a couple of great questions in the chat. If you want to unmute yourself, feel free to ask.
Yes, hi. Hi, yes, I'm Dawn. Yes, Dawn Chow Yi-Lin. Yeah, yeah. Hi from Singapore. Yeah, it's 8 something in the morning. Yeah, yeah. I just wanted to ask, the two editors, how they look at inclusivity and diversity. What kinds of initiatives will they take to try to promote inclusivity and diversity in the editorial board, as well as in terms of the kinds of research and publications that ASQ will be publishing. And do they have any advice for non-US based scholars? Because, for scholars who are not trained in US schools, it may be more of a challenge to publish, research that's interesting for US audiences. There have been lots of AOM sessions that have been, talking about this. Thank you.
So I'm gonna let you answer. I'll say one thing, and then I have my very first class tonight in 6 minutes, and I have to be on Zoom with my class. I apologize for having to bail out a couple minutes early, but I think it's a great question, Dawn. I think as I've been sort of talking to people about what I might do, going in thinking about ways to broaden the editorial board, make sure that we have broad representation is certainly something that I've been thinking about what are the ways that we can do that. It's something that I think is important. And Joan may know this. I feel like we have I wonder what the representation is of authors outside of the US. So when I was doing that quick skim, it didn't feel to me like I was only reading articles by people from the US. But I think that's good data that we should probably know and figure out where are the places where we might reach out. We did for a while. We were doing paper development workshops in different places in the world with the goal of trying to educate authors on what publishing for ASQ looks like. So that's something that we've done. We may continue to do. It's obviously hard to do in this moment in time, or we have to do it in a new way. But it is something that is important and we're thinking about. So thank you for raising it. And
okay, thank you.
I apologize for having to bail out, but thank you for including me in this.
Thank you so much, Christine.
See you later.
Thank you.
So, I can follow up. I mean, there are lots of dimensions of inclusivity. We do naturally quite well on some of them. I think the one that we are most aware of currently, which is partly actually a bias of who's, it's not a bias, but I think it's a level of awareness based on who is in the orbit and ASQ, is actually the global dimension. There is such a thing as possibly a globalization movement of organization theory, which sounds like an interesting and important thing to do. But how do you address that as a journal? Well, we've published some very pieces that I would consider to be really striking among the papers that I love the most also. You should see some of Chris Yanke's work in Africa, for example, and we have other things from various places in the world. Now you said U.S. trained. Chris is U.S. trained, so he does fall under that category. But still, it being close to a phenomenon that is outside the U.S. will teach you other things, and we're interested in that type of research. What have we done about it? We were a little bit behind the scenes, but when the Academy of Management started doing the globalization of organization theory workshop that was organized by my colleague at INSEAD Singapore, who I'm in close contact with, That was a very good initiative, and we had our own little conference, and I shouldn't strictly speaking call it an ASQ conference because there were other actors involved as well, but we had it, and it was a really interesting exchange of ideas. Now, we cannot do it in the form of multiple PDWs around the world, like the way that the Academy of Management does, because we are not an association journal with the resources that they have. We're a school journal, which means we can't send people out everywhere. But what we can do is we can take advantage of their investment, and we're perfectly willing to do that because we think we have a review process that functions very, very well for papers that are different in pretty much any dimension you can think of. I think what the AOM PDWs do is that they are raising awareness for globalization issues among the Academy of Management journals, and that is required because one of the differences between them and us is that there are much stricter requirements for connecting your research to things that have been done before in those journals than there is at ASQ. There's the point that I was making earlier that we are very open to research that is so big that it opens for something completely new. All right, so that's really part of our DNA. Now we've also taken advantage of the globalization movement, but we can't put a lot of people into it because we don't have a lot of people. So it will be in the background, but you should see it on the pages pretty soon.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that great question, Dawn. It looks like we are right at the time that we were originally allotted, but I know there are a few more questions coming in. So Henrich, just wanted to check and see if you're okay to stay on for another couple minutes.
We can keep going for a little bit. Sure, absolutely. Okay. Good questions. Sound like they need attention.
Okay, so I think we almost missed this one. It was from earlier on, but if you perhaps could take a moment. Let's see, I might have lost you in the chat, but you had asked about the changes in ASQ since Henrich and Christine were students themselves.
What are the changes? I mean, it's you're asking me to remember so far back. I'm not sure I can. I mean, we're a much bigger journal now. I hope you're aware of that. We have grown to really follow that the field is bigger, and the number of papers per year that meet the ASQ requirements is greater than it has been. How many of you are aware of the old model of 4 papers per issue with 4 issues? That adds up to 16. And that model was still in operation. I think it was in operation when I took over, or we were starting to add a little bit of papers before I took over, but it doesn't match the size and diversity of our field, and now we're in the mid-20s in terms of papers per year. It's just the right thing to do. Right, that's the biggest change, I think. We've been given more pages by our publisher. We have switched to online appendices, which means that we can make much more information about each paper available. And we can also make the portion that is in the official pages a little smaller, which also helps us publish more papers. We are aware that we have a reputation for having really long papers, which I am the first one to say is unfair because they're only long when they need to be long. When they don't need to be long, they're normal. But that's another thing that we're working on. we were a flexible journal to begin with, but we're now even more flexible thanks to the new technologies that we're using. Am I missing something important, Joan? You can pitch in here. Happy to take more questions.
Oh, okay. I was just checking to see if Joan, if you wanted to also jump in on that one.
No, honestly, I think, Henrich, you covered that very nicely. I do think there's been a lot of growth, and just the one thing that I would mention in addition to the fact that we're publishing more papers per volume, so per year, is that we also probably 4 or 5 years ago started developing a queue of online first publications. And so that's something for authors to be aware of, submitting authors to be aware of, is that the really nice thing about doing that is, even though you have to wait a little while perhaps to see your article appear in that issue, the reality is that as soon as it's posted online, it's been through the entire publication process. It's been edited, it is completely final, and that's what's going to appear in the issue. So it is published. It's published in electronic form, but it's published at that point. So we also have a really nice, robust queue of those articles that are just awaiting their issue assignment.
I should add that there are a couple of things that, so it wasn't well enough known that ASQ was a journal that lots of dissertations went into, and there was this idea that you had to be, well, let's put it bluntly, old and famous, and then you could get your paper into ASQ. When the reality was that we had a lot of papers from young scholars, and we've made that point over and over again, and I think that's well known now. We've had last time we do have a prize for the best dissertation-based paper, and nearly half of the previous volume were dissertation-based papers, which isn't too different from what it has been before, but nevertheless, it makes a point about how important we are early in the career, and it's when you consider how we evaluate papers, it actually makes sense, because we want the big papers, the ambitious papers, the ones that you spend a lot of time thinking about the research design, knowing just how busy, the older professors who are involved in teaching and administration become. There's just less time to think, and so a lot of the best papers they come out of dissertations, and so naturally that's what we take. We are also much more active in promoting papers than before through the a normal ASQ paper will now appear in 2 blogs, right? There's my blog, and then there's the ASQ blog with the interview. How many journals do that?
So we have a few other questions, so I'll just call out their names. So there's a question from Malika, and may have pronounced her name wrongly. So would you speak up and ask your question?
I'm sorry, you're still muted.
You're mute.
Yes.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you. So just a quick question about the time frame, because the tenure clock, for a junior faculty is ticking, and I know that all the journals are really working very hard, to get the reviews back on time. And so my question, it was kind of the average time frame if you get an R&R, which is itself a big thing. And hopefully that, after going through, what's the sort of the average round of reviews? Say 3 versus 4, and what's the average time frame for a paper to get, sort of conditionally accepted from the date of submission? Is it like 3 years versus 2 versus 4? Like just the average, and kind of the range would be nice too.
You're talking multiple years, which is the scariest thing to hear. It's mostly determined by the author, because each of our editors, if we see a paper going in the review process for more than 60 days, that's when you've submitted something, then the alarm bells start ringing, and we want to make sure that we get the reviews back in soon. When it comes to how many revisions, I mean, the norm we have, which isn't always possible, but we really don't want to stretch things, so we are much more likely to just reject in the first round if we see a long journey. I often call it a service to the field, because what we really do is that we give a good set of reviews, and the paper will be improved as a result of that, but we don't get the benefit of it. Some other journal will get it. But at least we don't keep dragging the author along for a long time, because that's it's the kind of thing that just creates a lot of bad reputation, resentment, because we are willing to reject the paper until the last moment. And so if you have somebody go through 2 reviews and then the third one comes in and we say reject, you will remember that for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
So it can happen, but we really don't want to do it. So we want to have the first R&R, the second R&R, and that should be it. We can't always do it, but we try to make it really short.
Okay.
So
Okay.
if I can jump in actually and just add, because there are obviously exceptions to this, and so I thought I might just give one example. You asked for not just the average, but also the potential range. As Henrich said, it really is so much driven by the author's own timing. And what I want to point out here is that we do try to be flexible within reason in accommodating the author's need for time to complete the strongest possible revision that they can provide. And personal circumstances obviously sometimes mean that we set an automatic deadline within the submission system for when we might anticipate seeing that revision come in. And then we're in touch with you, and depending on what your own circumstances are, sometimes a revision comes back in 6 months, and sometimes it comes back in 2 years. Obviously, that's going to change dramatically what we see, in terms of the total time and process. So I'll give you just one concrete example. There's a paper that just went online today, which is about callings in professions. And that paper, I do believe, was originally submitted in 2014. May have been 2015. I might be wrong about that, but it's been in process a long time, in part because it needed, it had great potential and just needed time to develop, and really required multiple rounds of reviewer feedback to get it there. But in part, it was also because of the author's own needs and timing. And I think the payoff was definitely worth it. It's a great article. If you haven't seen it today, I encourage you to go online and look at it. But I do want to just note the fact that we try to offer that personal flexibility so that you can, personal circumstances dictate that you can have the opportunity to craft the best possible revision.
Okay, thank you.
It's a fun paper, by the way. It will teach you why MDs and Parsons may be similar to each other, and why Parsons and Parsons may be different from each other in how they view their work.
No, thanks a lot. I really appreciate your comment and feedback. Thank you.
I just want to give anyone who's on the call who has a question a chance to go ahead and ask it, so you don't have to wait for us to find you. Otherwise, we've gotten a couple of anonymous questions that have come in that we can also ask. So we'll just take a moment there so any folks can unmute themselves.
May I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead, Jessica.
So in terms of the methodologies of papers published in ASQ, I think I see a lot more papers that use archival data or survey data than papers that use experiments. Myself being a micromanagement or organizational researcher, I'm trying to think what are the obstacles or things people who do experimental work should be very aware of. Like, I can imagine theoretical implication and being very innovative in terms of theory is obviously one important thing. But other than that, what might be some other things that experimentalists thinking about?
It's we're not different from the other journals there. We would assess experimental work the same way, which means that I guess one of the most recent issues that have come up and that everybody needs to be very aware of are the data quality problems that have started appearing with great force with online experimentation. I think you're aware of those that has been reported, and I think I don't know how and when that will be addressed, but it's probably largely returned to the labs. That will be the more reliable way of making experiments these days also. Which means that if you are in an area where the pandemic is making lab work difficult, it's possible that there will be some delays in making these in completing these papers. It's one of those things that, but it's a problem, but it's a temporary problem. At least the problem is actually making on-site experiments difficult. Hopefully it's also the unreliability of MTurk and similar platforms is also a temporary problem, but I don't know about good solutions to it yet. So, all right, well, we can take more questions.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. A few more questions have come in, but we also want to just respect your time. So you let us know. A few of these are actually surrounding the future of the journal. So, you know, in particular, I know that Christine had to head out for a class, but are there ways that you think that the editorial board may change as Christine is assuming leadership, and then what the impact of the review what impact to the review process might there be in terms of that transition? And then I'll roll it on up in the air with that transition to the new sort of editor-in-chief. Will there be any existing AEs that may be transitioning in or out? And if so, compound question, what is the last date that AEs may be stepping down to to continue to accept new submissions? So essentially, if I were to summarize those four-ish questions, there's just a deep interest in what this transition process looks like and what this means in specific for submitters.
So here's another unusual thing about the ASQ, which is that we're not really trying to signal anything through who our editors are, because we have a few decades of experience, a little longer than many other journals, and signaling through choice of associate editors is one of the least useful thing you can do as a journal, because the papers that people produce are what the paper that people produce. You get the same stuff regardless, and so we don't signal. We try to be very aware of what exactly are the submissions that we get, and how do we have a panel of associate editors that will match that as well as possible. And if we're a fairly small journal like ASQ, then each of our associate editors need to be a generalist. I mean, they are best known for their specialization, but what they can handle as editor is actually much broader than that, which is why you sometimes get surprises when you see what editor is assigned to handle your paper. You didn't know they could do that, but I know they can. And the same goes for Christine. So this is so this really means that we're pretty demand driven. The other thing is that when we try to create some sort of advantage, something we do better, experience is that advantage. And we know that you need some combination of handling enough papers per year and staying in enough years. 6 years, not 3 years, is a good editorial term. Longer if you can handle it, but there's also the issue of fatigue. So both, you know, associate editors need to know, and you know, they're smart people. They do know when they start getting tired and the decisions don't quite hold the quality that they should have, or they can anticipate that would happen during the next 3 years, because we have 3-year terms. So you know, you don't sign up for 1 more year except in exceptional circumstances. So those are really those are the parameters. So a lot of what is going to happen will be the decisions of associate editors. You can try to make some predictions by seeing when they join the team, but you can't quite do it because some people will stay longer than 6. So on the editorial board, it's even easier because there again, it all depends on what we need, and what we need gets reflected in how many reviews each of our editorial board members will do in the course of their term, which is 2 years. We all know how good they are. I mean, every single one will get reviews whenever there is something that is within their area of expertise. So if they don't get as many reviews as they should, the only thing it means is that their specialty is less popular currently, so maybe we need to rotate them out. And maybe we need to take them in later if it heats up again. We can do that.
And that might connect back to one of the earlier points around recommendations to people, you know, of folks who might be in a position to review.
We like to have a really big database, and the more you can make yourself known to us, for example, by submitting papers, the better it is.
All right, I think it's time to close. So thank you very much, Henrich, for your time. And although Christine had to leave in the middle, but a very special thanks to Christine as well. I would also like to thank the ASQ Editorial Board. So thank you, Joanne and Jeanette, for joining us today. So this is the first of these virtual sessions. So we plan to host this multiple times in the future. So stay tuned. We have ASQ Blog website, asqblog.com, and we also have a Twitter account, just posting it now. So stay tuned and check us out regularly. We also have the blog post and Spotify podcast on Spotify and iTunes as well. So thank you very much. See you next time.